You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
AGRA is an international NGO, non-government organization, which was established by Kofi Annan. At that time, he was Secretary General of the UN, and he was pushing the agenda for an African green revolution. How do we ensure that countries that have surplus food are able to supply it across the borders to areas where there's deficit? For a long time, you find certain production zones in Africa have not been connected fully to the markets, and there are many reasons to that. Definitely an expansion in geography, scope, but also in the level of engagement.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Daniel Njiwa, who is head of regional food trade at Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, where he leads interventions in improving the predictability of the policy and regulatory environment whilst coordinating investments for market activation. Welcome to the podcast, Daniel. How are you?
I'm very well, Tessa. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I believe you've been traveling quite a lot recently.
Yeah, it's that time of the year, when we normally do our, round of monitoring activities across, different countries. So, yeah, it's been a hectic period, up and down. I've just landed in Kigali now.
Oh, fantastic. Great city. It's great to have you on the podcast. I know we've had these conversations for quite a while regarding this conversation. So it's good that it's finally arrived.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. So before we get started, introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Daniel Njiwa.
So yeah, my name's Daniel Njiwa, as you rightly put it. I am Malawian. I'm trained agriculture economist, but working in the ag trade sector for the last close to 20 years now. I am currently working with the organization called AGRA, heading the regional food trade program, which is a brand new program. I had to start it off for them. But yeah, before AGRA, I have worked with COMESA Secretariat, which is a common market for, Southern and Eastern Africa. It's a regional economic community in that organization. I was, also dealing with the same kind of work, supporting the advancement of food security through trade and regional integration in Africa. So, yeah, I guess that's me. I am Malawian. I think I mentioned that, and have worked in Malawi half of my career, and the other half in these 21 years, I've been out in this region, particularly Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, covering, at least 15, 20 countries.
So you've given us a nice overview of who you are. You are Malawian, trade agriculture economist by profession and qualification. You're currently working for AGRA. So can you give us an overview of the work that AGRA is currently doing in Africa in terms of promoting regional food trade?
So, yeah, I see two questions in one. One is overall what AGRA is about and what they are doing in Africa. So, like I said, AGRA is an international NGO, non-government organization, which was established by Kofi Annan. At that time, he was Secretary General of the UN, and he was pushing the agenda for an African green revolution at that point, I think around 2005, 2006. And yes, since then, AGRA has been championing investments in, technology advancement in inputs like seeds. How do we increase productivity in African agriculture food systems? But over time has been transitioning, from a heavy focus on perhaps, technology or seeds to look at other facets of agriculture transformation, including, the performance of markets, the role of policy and regulations in agriculture development, and also things like the participation of private sector as key drivers of agriculture development and economic growth. So we are now in our second decade of implementation, and this time around, our shift is more a food systems approach. And it is in this vein that we feel elements of trade and markets are very critical and need to be elevated as we talk, food systems, because now we have increased the ecosystem that we operate in. It's no longer just production or, how much yield you put out. It is also more about how you handle that food, what type of food you're producing, how is it transferred from the farm to the fork, and what impact does this have on the environment. And as we're doing that, I think what we keep at the center is really inclusivity. How do we ensure that the small farmers, the small businesses, particularly women, youth, how are they participating and benefiting from this process of agriculture transformation? The second part, which is more what I do as a head of regional food trade in AGRA, is basically working on the market, particularly cross-border market space of agriculture development. And here we're looking at how do we improve the performance of food markets? How do we ensure that countries that have surplus food are able to supply it across the borders to areas where there's deficit? And as we're doing that, so many things come to play. One is the policy environment that govern the movement of food products across countries. And the second part is the capabilities of the actors in the market who are able to now aggregate, put together, sensible volumes in the right quality and move it into the other markets. So that brings two key sectors or actors at the center of our work. One is government or public sector, which is at national level, but also sometimes at regional level. And on the other hand, we have private sector. These are businesses, be it small, medium, or large. So really my role is to work with governments, support them, and ensure that they are creating the necessary enabling business-friendly, climate-friendly environment, regulatory environment for food to move across the borders. On the other side, we work with the private sector to support, strengthen their capabilities and capacities to aggregate, to, comply to the policy environment or regulatory environment, but also, access the right pieces of information that allows them to participate in the market more efficiently.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Daniel. So you've detailed the work of AGRA and your role in advancing regional food trade in African agriculture and the work that you're doing with government and private sector. So if you can go into more detail regarding regional food trade, I was hoping you could walk us through some of the strategies or programs that you've implemented to promote intra-regional trade with regards to African agriculture.
So, that's a very important question. And I don't want to sound cocky here as if, whatever we are doing in AGRA is everything. I think we recognize that there are other organizations and institutions and players that are also doing their part, because this piece of work is really a heavy lift. If you look at the statistics right now, continentally, agriculture trade is still very, very low, like under 15% of intra-regional African agriculture trade. So that's really a very low number compared to, some regional economic communities, either in Europe or in the Asia region or the Americas. They're trading more between themselves, and perhaps the numbers above, 60% intra-regionally. So we have a heavy workload in Africa to just deliver that. And there are many reasons why we should be looking at this as with a sense of urgency. One is, as shocks happen, such as climate shocks or even wars, we've seen recently, the conflicts even in Russia and Ukraine. We've seen, health shocks like COVID happen. All of these impact how the agriculture food sector functions. We have seen global supply chains failing in the middle of these shocks. We have seen production really getting depressed to the levels that put our people, as I'm speaking to you, over 250 million people in Africa are on the verge of starvation. So these kinds of things are just reminding us that we really need to do more between our countries, between neighbors and within the continent. And what does it take really to see more of internal production, more of countries that are neighboring each other, sharing food or trading in food. And that's where we go into these kinds of strategies, addressing policy issues, addressing regulations, addressing investments, addressing infrastructure, quality standards, and all sorts of things. As we come to specifically what AGRA has been investing in, like I said before, a number of things that, or at least the major area that AGRA has been involved in for the longest period is really supporting small farmer agriculture productivity. So boosting production is our number one entry point, where we're seeing, you can't trade what you don't have. You need to first have a surplus, and then you put it on the market. So we've been working to support access to the right inputs, seeds, fertilizers, but also putting in place the right policies that enable small farmers to put more as output from their farms. Beyond the farm, we've been supporting a lot of businesses as well as farmer organizations in creating and establishing relationships. So I think for a long time, you find that certain production zones in Africa have not been connected fully to the markets. And there are many reasons to that. One could be infrastructure, which you can't just move anything out. But the other and more important, maybe soft side of things, is what we do by building these relationships through models that we call sometimes consortia. So we bring private sector in contact with production zones, with farmers' organizations, and thereby creating a relationship that allows farmers access inputs or financing to buy inputs, but also the private sector accessing the raw materials that they need. And beyond that, we're looking at aggregation services, and then we're looking at crossing the border. We have currently a few strategic investments that I want to pin down today. One is what we're doing in Eastern Africa, countries between Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, and the likes of Rwanda. We are implementing what we're calling Tanganyika Trade Facilitation Initiative. So this is where we bring in business development service providers that work with private sector and farmer organizations to establish these relationships that I'm talking about. But they take their work forward in also facilitating the crossing of the border. How do you apply for permits? How do you, get certification for quality? And then how do you cross the border? All of that. So the second strategic investment that we have is in West Africa, which is what we're calling ECOWAS Rice Observatory. So this is more or less a public-private sector platform, pretty much a loose network of all key actors in the rice value chain, from research, production, processing, transportation, trading, as well as policymakers. They sit on one platform and they exchange ideas, they exchange notes as to what are the challenges that we are facing and how do we address these? What are the opportunities that exist and how do we leverage and how do we nurture or harness those opportunities? So that's a platform that we find really strategic in really building a strong rice sector in West Africa. If you are aware, there's a push by the ECOWAS, which is a regional economic community in West Africa, to implement a rice offensive initiative. You might know that West Africa is the biggest importer of rice in Africa, continental, as a key staple food. The aim of this rice offensive initiative by ECOWAS is to see to it that ECOWAS is able to produce its own rice and maybe even approach self-sufficiency rather than relying on global imports. I will not go into details, but I go to the third and probably last but one strategic initiative that AGRA is implementing now on the policy side of things. What I shared earlier on the private sector market shaping side of things. But on the policy side of things, one major gap that we've seen is policies that are made often in a vacuum with less data or evidence to make those decisions, creating a level of uncertainty in the market or unpredictability, where private sector are not sure, should I invest in this area or should I invest in that area? Or do we pull investments out or do we bring in more investment? So what we've seen as AGRA is most of these governments at regional or national level lack solid numbers on which to base their decisions. And these numbers start from as simple as what is the harvest that is expected? How much stock do we currently have? How much do we need as our consumption as a country, but also as a region? And how are prices moving? And for us to address that, we have developed what we're calling a digital regional food balance sheet. So there's been attempts to develop food balance sheets before, but the weaknesses of the initial attempts was that the data was hardly available at real-time basis, and it's difficult to make decisions on like 1 year old data. What we've done with the current initiative is to leverage satellite technology, crop modeling techniques, and also, relationships with governments to be able to forecast using these satellite images and estimations, forecast how, the crop is looking like, and be able to predict that in the next 4 months, this is the kind of harvest that we should expect in maize, rice, or soybeans. And we've started this in about 6 countries in East and Southern Africa. And we believe it's going to be a game changer. This thing is already launched, and governments have already started using this platform to be able to make decisions. So they are able to sit in a corner of Malawi and say, okay, Rwanda looks like they're going to have a bumper harvest in rice, or Tanzania is going to suffer deficit in maize. This is what we should be doing.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Daniel. You slightly touched on this when detailing that regional trade in Africa is low, around 15%. So what are some of the biggest challenges or barriers to regional food trade in Africa?
So, like I said, there are many things. Let me put it this way. One of the major reasons is, of course, low productivity. So, because production in Africa is predominantly small scale, it's an interesting fact. Unlike other countries, whatever they produce mostly is coming from commercial or large-scale farmers. In Africa, I think we consume from the local consumption, local produce that we consume, it's about 70 to 80% is coming from small farmers. That's being produced from small-scale farmers. And these are farmers that really struggle to get the right inputs and get the right services, technologies to produce more and put in the market. But even in isolated cases where production has gone very well, the challenges now take a different shape. The infrastructure limitation in Africa generally is just very bad, to the extent that it's very costly to move products. Actually, the cost of transportation in Malawi is estimated to be almost double the average global logistics cost. And that's a major, major reason that we lose competitiveness in our products. It's easier, for Ghana to import rice from Vietnam or somewhere else rather than buying from Burkina Faso because of all of these inefficiencies in productivity, but also transportation and logistics. But the other thing that we've also come across, and this is more policy related, is the issue of non-tariff barriers.
Yes.
So you might understand that Africa has just recently launched the Continental Free Trade Area, essentially saying you don't have to pay taxes on anything that you produce in Africa and you're trading it in Africa. That's maybe the simplest definition. And you don't have to control in terms of quota or what have you. But you find that even with those frameworks, and ACFTA is new, yes, but there's been old frameworks like, the COMESA FTA, ECOWAS, free trade, and SADC free trade. Even with those frameworks in place, you still find that goods, particularly food, is not moving as it should because of what we deem as non-tariff barriers. So we've removed the tariffs, but there are still certain, barriers, blockages that are restraining the movement of goods. So you get to the border, you have to fill 20 pieces of paper, you are transporting on the road, you have probably 10, 20 border points or search points. And all of that just builds the cost of doing business to the extent that it's no longer profitable, no longer efficient. So these are really major problems that impact the growth of intra-regional trade in Africa. I could go on and on. The policy that I've mentioned to you, the countries are still not sure, whether they can rely on their neighbors or whether they should be supplying their neighbors. And they tend to take more nationalistic or protective kind of policy stances where you see, export bans being implemented left and right. For countries that are supposed to be in surplus, they close the border. They say, no, we are not exporting to any other country. All of that are reasons that trade really is still stagnating for agriculture products.
Interesting. So if we look at areas such as infrastructure, such as transportation and storage facilities, how would you say they impact regional food trade in Africa?
Those are heavy investments, but I tend to look at that with a positive spin. Yeah? When you say we don't have enough storage infrastructure, that should be rather an opportunity for a business to say, hey, by the way, Kenya, at least on an annual basis, looks for 400 to 500,000 tons of maize. this is a known fact. But the challenge that we are seeing is issues to do with quality, because there's poor storage infrastructure in the markets of surplus, like Uganda, maybe Tanzania. That should be looked at as a positive thing, as an opportunity to businesses, an attraction for indirect investment to say, come in, build your infrastructure and do the handling of maize, and you supply a market next door, because the market is been there forever, and it's going to be there forever because of all of these challenges we face. So I think these infrastructure, particularly on the transportation, handling and storage, but also even ICT, communications, sharing of information and what have you, all of these have a big and massive impact on trade. If you don't have a good road, if you don't have good ports and handling facilities, the cost of you doing business in agriculture just escalates. To move a ton of maize from Lusaka to Nairobi, just the cost of transport is $200 per ton.
Oh, wow.
And if you put cost of purchasing that ton, it's like easily you are landing a ton of maize in Nairobi from Lusaka at $400, maybe $500. And if you compare that with maize from Mexico that lands in Mombasa at, maybe 200 tons, $200 a ton, it's landed in Mombasa, and maybe you add another $50, it's in Nairobi. So you can't compete. So even if you produce your maize at almost the same cost as Mexico would, we will suffer from the logistics and handling costs that come in as you're moving that product from where it is being produced to the market. So these are real challenges. On the handling and storage side of things, we've seen situations where so much volume has gone to waste. I remember the time I was in Zambia one other year, the government had to destroy literally 50 to 100,000 tons of maize just because it had gotten rotten, because they didn't have a proper place to store it. It got rained on and all this. And that's a loss. Those are real challenges in the market of food in agriculture. But also, like I said, there are opportunities. There are opportunities for businesses to come in to say, how do we invest in rail infrastructure in Africa to connect? Some of these rail lines already exist. They just need perhaps a 50-kilometer connection or a link somewhere. All of those are things that need to be looked at as opportunities. Investment in warehousing, investment in quality infrastructure and all this. Yeah, so that's how I would put it.
I agree. You mentioned looking at the opportunities. So by removing these barriers and improving regional trade, how do you believe regional food trade would contribute to, food security and agricultural development in Africa?
It's actually a big impact area, if you put it that way. And it's an impact area from many levels. If you look at the economies of most of the African countries, they have a significant stake in agriculture, ranging easily. In some countries, the economies have greater than 50% contribution from agriculture.
Yes.
If you look at employment, easily averaging 60% if you take the agri-food value chain in its totality, like production, handling, processing, and even retailing. It easily averages of, 50-60% across the continent. And those are jobs. And if you look at nutrition, you can't just, ignore that, because there's a whole lot that really hinges on agriculture and trade, because as you're moving food from one place to another, you're also diversifying your diet in a way. You're able to access certain products that perhaps your market doesn't offer, and thereby, diversifying your diet. So there's many impact areas that are associated with production in agriculture, but importantly, marketing and trade. And like I said earlier, 70 to 80% of everything that is produced in Africa and consumed in Africa, it's actually produced and transported or transacted by small farmers and SMEs. So if you improve by any metric the performance of the markets, how much you are exchanging between countries, you are impacting a large volume of SMEs, increasing their incomes, creating more jobs. You are impacting the small farmers that are now not going to be reliant on subsidies anymore, because they are now earning a better income from their participation in the markets to afford even more to invest in the sector, and thereby growing it. So it's that cycle that, if managed properly, can be self-lubricating and produce even much wider impact on many levels: jobs, economy, food security, nutrition, but also even on the climate side of things.
Fantastic. So it's clear that the impact is far-reaching and touches all parts of African society and economy. Earlier, you mentioned improving the inclusivity of African agriculture and the role of smallholder farmers and SMEs. So if smallholder farmers and SMEs are a pivotal, group within African agriculture, how can we go about incentivizing them so that they play a bigger role in contributing to food security in Africa?
I think that's a very important question. I always say SMEs or small players in agriculture are actually the future of agriculture economic development in Africa, and not necessarily the large ones, but not without the large ones. I hope I'm clear there.
Yes.
So it's more the future of agriculture development or transformation, and not the large, but not without the large. Our aim in AGRA is really to try and activate and incentivize these small SMEs and small farmers. And the models that we've been testing and scaling out, in some cases, actually involve the large. So how do we, for example, bring in a large processor, a Nestle, an MNC that's taking a lot of raw materials, sometimes from global markets? How do we support them or work with them, collaborate with them to change their sourcing strategy, to look more internally, to source from small farmers? And what are they looking for that we can address as a development organization? And we've succeeded in many levels. And I know we've worked with the likes of Nestle in Ghana, who are sourcing cassava and other products. We've worked with the likes of Export Trading Group, Bidco in Kenya, in Tanzania. So our aim is really to say, hey, you are large, but your sourcing strategy is not helping us because it's not looking at the small farmers. Because then what are the issues? What is the question? What do you want addressed? And they tell us what we need is stability of supply. What we need is this type of quality, that what we need is certainty in consistency in supply. And how do we assure that? So work backwards on the supply chain to identify what are the points, organizations that we need to work with to ensure we are addressing what the buyer at the top of the chain requires. And we then invest in technical assistance to build capabilities for quality, build capabilities for aggregation, build capabilities for consistency in production, access to inputs and all that. So we believe by doing that, we are actually developing inclusive supply chain systems for small farmers and small businesses. But beyond that, as AGRA, we also have an inclusive financing agenda. And this is a program that allows us to, support small businesses that are struggling to access financing. Maybe, and the cost of financing in Africa is just, astronomical. And our aim is to say, okay, what are the kind of de-risking models? What are the kind of blended finance initiatives that will try and bring down the cost of finance for these small businesses? And sometimes we go even up to the policy level. What are the set of policies that governments should be implementing or putting in place that enables small businesses, small farmers access finance in a cheaper way, or sometimes even directly with the private financing institutions. And some donors have provided resources for that. You put in a guarantee fund in a bank to say, hey, who takes the first loss on this loan book? Should they default or something like that? So those are some of the models that we are putting in place to ensure that we are inclusive as possible. And in some cases, we actually are quite deliberate in terms of who we want to work with. We need, say, for example, 50-50 in terms of gender disparity for our beneficiaries. So if we're coming into an organization to support them in one way or another, the condition is let's have women participating, let's have the youth participating, and this is the ratio that you want to have. So those are certain examples that AGRA is pushing forward to ensure that we are as inclusive as possible in our investments.
Brilliant. So you've highlighted some key areas such as finance, policy, and capacity development. So if we look outside of those areas, what role does technology and innovation play in supporting, agricultural development?
Technology is a big word, and rightly so. And we keep learning. I'll tell you, over time, I think we've actually adapted our strategy as AGRA to pay closer attention to technology, particularly on the digital side of things. So the example even I gave you earlier on the regional food balance sheet, it's founded on digital principles. And we believe this is one way you're going to get information, pass it around in a timely fashion, but also get it as widely as possible. And we have also some examples that we have used, such as our digital extension model. So we have a model where we have village-based advisors, for example. So these are like local volunteers, sometimes for a small fee, that are able to help local farmers, businesses in sharing information on, agriculture production practices or market information and what have you. And we've embedded a digital component to it to allow them, receive information, very, very efficiently, in short time, real time, and then pass it on to others. We have also invested in some trading platforms. So this is a key lesson also coming from out of COVID. You see, before COVID, there was just this predominance of physical trading spaces. You have to meet, you have to exchange goods and what have you. But we learned with COVID that digital is actually the way forward. And we have supported a few platforms for e-commerce, e-soko, that allow farmers and businesses to connect on a digital platform and say, this is what we're trading, the volume we have. And then they start negotiations on that level. We have supported commodity exchanges that are also really fully built on digital tools, such as the Malawi Agriculture Commodity Exchange and others, AFEX in Nigeria.
Yes.
So that's just our principle. Market information is fully digitized in AGRA, and that's part of the technology that we're using. But technology, like I said, goes beyond just digital. Yeah, like I said initially, we believe investments that AGRA has made over the last 15, 16 years in producing hybrid varieties or seeds has helped to improve access for small farmers to really have potent kind of seeds and inputs for their production. Some of the seeds that we've produced have actually been very good at addressing and resisting, pests and diseases, and even surviving stressed conditions, droughts or short rain cycles and what have you. So all of that is investments in technology that AGRA has put in the sector to just help build, resilience of farmers in production, but also in the yields that we expect.
Fantastic. So you've detailed how you've invested in platforms, working with locals and a range of key stakeholders. So with this in mind, I was wondering if we could discuss how AGRA works with governments and policymakers to create that enabling environment for regional food trade.
Yeah, let me underscore I would say, currency that AGRA uses, and it's been in the works for a long time. It's not easy to work with governments. You don't just come today and say, hey, do that, and they listen to you.
Very true.
Exactly. So it's been work, over the last decade or so of slowly establishing and creating trust with, multiple governments in the continent. What our approach is really to, first of all, look at what is the agenda of the continent, like from the level of the Africa Union. The next level is what is the objective or the policy direction of a particular country in light of the continental ambitions such as CARDIP, or in light of global ambitions that most of these governments are signatories to, like the Sustainable Development Goals. What is the direction? And what we do is plug ourselves in those agendas and say, hey, government, hey, Zambia, hey, Malawi, we have come to work with you to achieve your own ambition, to achieve your own agenda and objectives. And how or where do you need our support? So I think by doing that consistently over the last 10 or so years, we have created a level of trust whereby they take us as, cousins or friends, and not necessarily a donor that comes maybe with conditionalities and what have you. They know we have the best interest of their own objectives and ambitions. So for the trade in particular, trade is a very sensitive area, like I've mentioned before. Just because, countries have different resource endowments and what have you, we produce different things and at different levels and efficiencies. Government's posture, default postures mostly is to, protect their own. which is we produce for our own people. Otherwise, we lose votes and what have you. So in order to get a government to participate fully in trade, there's really a lot of negotiation that has to happen. And the currency that we have and the trust and that we have, integrity we have with governments allows us now to come to them and present this case in a sober way, using numbers to say, hey, by the way, you have the right environment for producing maize. In this particular year, you actually had a surplus of maybe 20%, and you could actually do better, and then you sell the surplus to the other countries. But this is what you need. You need your policies to change this way. You need that policy to change that. So AGRA has been investing in technical assistance, has been investing in advisory with governments, has been investing in capacity strengthening in regulatory bodies of governments. But the important part is we use an inside track approach of influencing. We don't just go out on the radio to blast governments or critique them. We go into their offices and say, can we bring an advisor to help you sort out this problem? Or do you need training in this area? And then that way they are able to, slowly change their policy regimes with respect to trade, be more open to using evidence in making decisions, be more transparent as they consult with the private sector who need this information. Because it's not always that keeping the borders open is the right thing. Sometimes, yes, you might want to regulate that. But what is important is you want to communicate that to the business sector at the right time, in the right manner. And in advance of anybody making losses. So that's what has been our approach with governments in this area.
Fantastic. The collaborative approach is key to making change. So if we look outside of government and focus on private sector, what opportunities exist for private sector involvement and investment for food trade in Africa?
Yeah, I think there are many, and I think I kind of hinted on some areas already. But trade is probably at the tail end of everything, like I mentioned. First of all, you have to produce and create a surplus. So looking at Africa right now, we import annually over 80 billion when you're talking about net food imports. So you net off what you have exported and from what you are importing, and you get 50 billion. But in actual fact is we are approaching $100 billion annually on imports of food in the continent. And that alone is an opportunity for private sector. What we're saying here is, can we produce this $100 billion worth of food in Africa? What? So what do you need to do? There's opportunities in investments in irrigation, for example. For now, we're only irrigating 5% of all, potential irrigable land in the continent. So why can't we increase that? Why can't somebody come in and invest in irrigation infrastructure? For now, we're importing things like maize. We're importing things in North Africa, particularly. We're importing things like rice. We're importing things like soybean or soybean products and edible oils. What this tells you is all of these are high potential sectors. You can produce maize here, you can produce soybeans here, you produce rice here, but also you can invest in value addition. Why should we be importing edible oils when we can produce soybeans or we can produce sunflower and crush it, process it here, cottonseed, process it here? Why should we import spaghettis and cereals and what have you when all of these things can be processed here in Africa? All of these are high potential kind of investments that we should be looking at. And then the other area is what I told you earlier about, which is logistics. For now, we use a lot of road transport to move our products. So there's a whole lot of opportunity in the tracking system. We have, I've mentioned, a skeleton framework of rail lines, but this can be improved and somebody can collect toll fees on it by just connecting sometimes as short distances like 50-kilometer connection. Malawi and Zambia have a short distance to connect on a rail. If you connect that, you open the whole of Tanzania, Congo, Zambia, Malawi to the port in Nakala or Beira easily by rail. That's cutting a cost of trading by maybe 50-60%. So those are areas. In storage, we hardly have any serious storage facilities. Both with the public sector storage facilities are either run down, they're not used efficiently. There's an opportunity to, have public-private sector partnerships around them, but also even outside of public sector, why not go out into the hinterland where most of the losses, like we are losing in grains easily 30% post-harvest losses in the continent. That's unthinkable in other places. It's just because this farmer doesn't even have a cement slab, or doesn't have a tarpaulin way to dry this maize. These are small investments. If we can reduce the cost of producing tarpaulins, and every farmer has access to, a drying place, they have access to a small facility where they can store their bags of rice and what have you, all of that will drastically improve the efficiencies in food trade in the continent. But at the same time, these are obvious opportunities for investment for private sector.
I agree. You mentioned that Africa imports almost $100 billion of food a year. So I guess as a consequence of that, the last couple of years, Africa has faced some extreme food security challenges due to COVID pandemic, Russia-Ukraine crisis. What do you think we've learned from this?
There are a number of lessons. One and most important is we can't continue to rely on global markets, because they are not immune or not insulated to shocks. Two countries fighting in the world, and an extra 50 million people drifting into food insecurity immediately. I mean, that's unthinkable, because what it's telling you are over-relying on somebody else behaving normally. When things, go south, then everybody suffers. I think that's a major takeaway. And I think there's agreement and commitment at the political leadership of the African continent that we should be looking at producing more of our own food, produce what you eat locally, so that we are at least cushioned. We are becoming more resilient to any shocks. When they hit and there is nowhere to look at and get food from, we are able to look at your neighbor and survive on it. I think that's a critical lesson. The other lesson, perhaps more tied to the climate, is really the urgency in boosting investments around climate resilience has just been elevated right now. With small climate shocks, stresses, we see tens and tens of millions of people going to food insecurity. That shouldn't be entertained. That shouldn't be the case going forward. So we need to increase investments in more climate resilient production technologies and practices, investments in irrigation, investments in crop diversification, more resilient to climate shocks and what have you. That's a key lesson we should be taking away. I think with respect to COVID, the main lesson that we learned is, apart from digital, when I told you that, okay, people don't have to face each other physically to trade. And that also comes with logistics. If you're doing this digitally, if you're exchanging goods digitally, you need to have an efficient logistics system. Trigger Foods, if you know this company, yes, founded by one Peter Njonjo, yes, is just changing the landscape. It probably grew threefold, fourfold during COVID, because that's when it made sense. They have mapped everybody, outlets, they're mapping supply, mapping demand, and trying to match that and see, logistically, how do we organize our consignment to deliver most efficiently. So you can only do that if you know your market, if you know your outlets, and you can aggregate the demand to say, okay, this is what they need in this corner of Nairobi, and that's what they need in that corner. And then you communicate digitally, almost real-time basis, to your transporters, your logistics handlers, and your farmers that are aggregating to just put the food to the right spaces and cut away all of the inefficiencies, the losses in storage, the losses in time and cost. So these are real lessons that we have taken on board. And all of these must also be reflected in the policy side of things, because there's always a role of government in policy as well as state capabilities to ensure that all these ambitions are achieved. If you want to go overdrive in irrigation, you have to revisit your tax regime for irrigation equipment or irrigation investments. Similarly, if you want to go overdrive in warehousing or in logistics, you have to revisit certain things. So that's how we want to look at these things.
Thank you for that, Daniel. So you've detailed some of the positive trends that we're seeing due to lessons learned from COVID pandemic and Russia-Ukraine conflict. So if we look past current trends and look at the future, from a food security, agricultural development perspective, where do you see Africa in 5 years' time?
That's a loaded question. 5 years' time. I mean, seriously, Tessa, you see, crawl back a bit, the impact of the shocks that we've experienced the last 3 years
Yes.
have eaten into the gains that we have made over the last 20.
Oh, wow.
Easily, yeah, because there were trends that we were observing, even on the trade side of things. Countries were becoming now more open to trading and what have you, creating more predictable and trading spaces. And you could easily say, with certainty that next year we'll buy maize from Tanzania. But with these shocks, you can no longer say that with certainty. Yeah, we have been seeing trends in investments, agriculture investments, particularly from a public or development partner point of view, steadily increasing over the last decade or so. With COVID, we saw that money going into other spaces, going into health, emergency, and what have you. So with more investment going into kind of addressing shocks reactionally than going into sustainable economic drivers of agriculture transformation. So if you ask me what's the outlook in the next 5 years, I will not be very bullish on that, because my feeling is we have a lot to cover the ground where we experienced all of these negatives. So it's going to be just building back the gains that we've lost, and maybe hopefully creating a stable groundwork for a much more now positive outlook beyond 5 years, to then start to regain, increases in yields, increases in investments in certain growth drivers like irrigation, maybe more investments in the trade sector again, or in the market sector development again. So that's my feeling. I think, let's put it this way, in 5 years, we'll probably just cover the ground that we lost and just be in a place we were 3 years ago.
I guess with that in mind, if we look at AGRA, where would the focus be over the next 5 years? Would it be quite similar?
So as AGRA, we continue to push. As AGRA, like I said, we are taking a new strategic shift. As I'm speaking to you, we're just starting a brand new strategy for the next 5 years. It's starting this year. It's going to be taking a stronger orientation towards food systems, whereby we will be looking at, yes, agriculture transformation, but in a much wider lens than before, beyond production and just marketing and trading, to more what are we producing, how are we taking care of the environment, nutrition issues, and how are we being inclusive even better than before. So really AGRA's plan right now is expand the geography. So we're going to go beyond the 11 countries that we had before. Maybe we'll hit 20 countries, maybe 25 countries by the next 5 years. And we will expand our tentacles beyond the things that I mentioned, beyond just facilitating or supporting production and trading and policies for production and policies for markets, to looking at more environmental, more nutrition, more rounded kind of efficiencies in taking a food systems approach. So that's how we are seeing AGRA in the next 5 years. Definitely an expansion in geography, in scope, but also in the level of engagement with governments as well as private sector.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are good or when times are challenging. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Yeah, maybe I borrow from what Aristotle said, that every great mind does not exist without a dash of insanity or madness.
Yes.
And why I like this quote is because the challenges that we face don't always need, the business as usual kind of responses. We need to allow ourselves some space to experiment. We need to allow ourselves, a level of ambition that's not always normal or average, to address the challenges that are coming. And I think as we allow ourselves that freedom, I think that's the only way we can significantly leapfrog the challenges that the African continent is facing. Without it, I think we'll just remain very average.
Brilliant. I agree, because some of the extreme challenges you see, they always seem impossible to find a solution. So you sometimes have to have a bit of, how did you put it?
Madness.
A bit of madness. I agree 100%. So as we're coming to the close of today's conversation, I was wondering if you had any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you're doing at AGRA.
Yeah, no, I wish I had that platform and gravitas to start to mete out calls to action and what have you. I really feel that we have more able people in more, perhaps stronger, bigger platforms that should be encouraging everybody to take certain decisions, radical decisions to just get things going. I, in my small way, really just love when I have these conversations with African ministers to just encourage them to adopt the Aristotle mantra, that hey, you will not solve these challenges the same way you did 10 years ago. You need to think differently. You need to be more open-minded. You need to be experimental sometimes. Learning and failing is actually part of greater learning. That's what we're saying. So I think my word, if any of the political leaders and decision makers out there are listening, is let's try different measures. For me, from where I'm sitting as a trade practitioner, I think I would encourage them to keep markets open. I'm seeing situations that are pretty depressing in some countries. You see, when you close your border and everybody had just a bumper harvest that year, what it means is they're just going to go into poverty because the prices drastically drop. And governments must be aware, politicians must be aware of this to say, if we want to empower our people, our producers, and who are in majority, we just have to make these sober decisions. Keep your borders open, keep investing in the right growth drivers, invest in irrigation, invest in climate adaptation, mitigation, ensure that your farmers have access to the right inputs, they are capacitated, the SMEs have built, productive capacities to respond to the market and be able to compete with what is being imported from other global markets. I think these are decisions that may be tough, sometimes expensive, but have to be taken.
Fantastic. That is a great way to end today's conversation. You've touched on some key points, key areas. One thing that you said that I really agree with is that everyone has a part to play, no matter how big or small. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today. Also, as a fellow trade professional, It's been a great conversation. So thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Tessa. Lovely speaking with you.
It's lovely speaking to you too, and we will speak soon.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.